Hello and welcome to part 3. Now, as usual, you can get off the long patrol on the pirates in the China station for the Royal Navy. Now, hello Roger, go back there. We are joined by the fluffy research assistant today, so he might wander in and say hello. He's currently reclining on the whole bed, but the reason I've set up the camera so it can see part of the bed, and believe it or not, this was a neat bed until he did his thing. I've put the camera so it basically can see him if he comes in. Anyway, on with today's, part 3. So, for starters, part 3. Well, there's going to be a lot of words in this one. And we're going to have to skip all the way up to 1931 to 1940 and what's going on. Now, in 1931, you have Vice Admiral Sir William Archibald Howard Kelly, who is a lovely gentleman, but I can't find a decent picture of him that I'm allowed to use anywhere. And in fact, the one for Admiral Sir Frederick Charles Dreyer comes from the Hood Association website, and with proper accreditation, I think I'm allowed to use it. So I'm crediting them and hoping I'm allowed to use it. So Howard Kelly, well, he noted in 1931, even for the China station where dull moments are unusual, it was not known to be a quiet station on post. The month of September has been one of considerable excitement. Hello, you're getting closer and closer. If you want to come up in my lap, just jump up in my lap. I'll move the camera a bit. And then if he jumps up in my lap, you won't lose me completely. So, the assumption of office by the new government, United Kingdom, and consequent economy measures always fun. The advance of the Cantonese forces against Nanking, with the prospects of increased unrest in the Yangtze Valley, the commencement of the fall of the river, when trouble in Hakna became might be expected, the unrest in the Atlantic Fleet, in the Gordon Mutiny, and various other things going on, the Japanese aggression in Manchuria, and the change of sterling from a gold basis, with its serious effect on ships' companies and paid in silver, were events all calling for the closest attention. So as you can see, the China station has to juggle not just the stuff happening on the China station, but the stuff happening at home. In fact, that's the whole product of this time and this period. It's what you have to understand. A deployment on the China station is a long-range deployment, and it's what you're going to be doing does, in many ways, depend as much on what's going on out there as at home. Admiral Frederick Charles Dreyer. What can we talk about this gentleman? Well, of course, he ends up at one point running the Fleet Air on in World War II. He technically retires before World War II, then comes back as a convoy commodore and goes through various different roles, including at one point liaison to the British Army, at which point the British, someone in the British Army commented that rather than the British Army being sent back to Europe, why don't they just send Dreyer? They're fairly sure the Germans will either run or cry. He's an interesting gentleman. And again, you either send a diplomat or you send a Dreyer. But why do you send these officers out there? Why? What are they doing? What are they there for? The China station, we're talking about counter-piracy. It's one of the big reasons for the Navy being out there officially. So, some key events. Great Depression hits in 1931 and doesn't start to lift till 1933. The government doesn't want to spend any money. The government really doesn't want to spend any money. Plus, the Kuomintang, the Chinese national government, is growing in power and ability. It's becoming viable to actually rely upon the Chinese to do their own operations. So this starts to affect whether or not the British are actually going to be doing operations. And the British sort of start to move more to assisting in operations. And in January, there are some incidents which I will get into at the end of this slide. I will first, though, talk about the things on the other side, the far side away from me, and I'm going to expand on this one. Because this is produced with information sourced from Edward R. Lucas's Public Goods and Private Interest, British Counter-Piracy efforts in Hong Kong and the South China Sea, 1921 to 1935, paper presented to the International Studies Association International Conference in Hong Kong. They did ask that you seek their permission before republication, which is why I have not shown the whole paper by any stretch of the imagination or put a link to it, but I have pointed out where it comes from, and I have tried to email them, but I think I've found an old email address because it hasn't got through. So, I apologize. But it was too good, and this was a topic to not cite. In June 1931, the large merchant marine company Swire & Sons sued the government of Stanley Baldwin for not providing adequate protection against pirates. Their arguments were with the fact that the government was going to bill them for the soldiers who was placing aboard ships for their protection. I.e., the government was trying to move from a active approach of blasting the living daylights out of piracy to letting the local government actually do its job, but still needing to do some passive defense of very specific ships. Now, they're talking about ships which are not only owned and flagged as British, but which were based in Britain. Now, Lucas's argument is that this is mostly to do between the social contract and the fact that these people belong to the same clubs and these are sort of politicians. And I can see a certain measure of that, and I would agree that to an extent. But there is a to an extent, and I'll be getting into a later case as to why I believe that's to an extent, rather than a wholeheartedly full-throated concur. While the court agreed that the government had a political duty to protect British subjects, even abroad, it felt the government was not under any legal obligation to protect British ships in China from piracy. Now, this distinction is interesting because, as I said, it goes against especially the previous governor of Hong Kong's more activist, unilateral and punitive approach which have been pushed, i.e. the big airstrikes which HMS Hermes took part on, which HMS Eagle, I think, did one or two as well, and HMS Argus got involved in. Interesting, the Navy had been supportive of these operations, but it hadn't been supportive of them in terms of considering piracy and counter-piracy operations. It was basically feeling it was demonstrating an island-taking capability to the Japanese. And we can do this. We can do a full-on amphibious assault with carrier support and everything. It's a live exercise, not a drop of a hat, virtually. Swire & Sons appealed the ruling, and this time using the feudalistic argument that as the subject oweth to the king true and faithful allegiance and obedience, so the king is to govern and protect his subject. And in one of the most levitatious moments of the Court of Appeal's history, I do believe, their response is, Henry II would, I think, have been surprised to hear that if his tenant went to China, the king was bound to follow and protect him. It's all fun and games. Now, we now introduce to some interesting topics. There is the Shanghai incident and the attempted coup in Japan. Now, the Shanghai incident is probably more well known. It's the January 28th incident, and it takes place in 1932. And pretty much anti-Japanese demonstrations are provoked following the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. I wouldn't. There's different debates as to whether or not it's just there are actual activist Japanese officers actually instigating the demonstrations, or whether they are merely fanning the flames, or whether it's just happening on its own course. You can never be quite sure. But what we do know is that the Japanese respond by sending some ultra-nationalist Japanese Buddhist priests that belong to the Nikkaren sect to Shanghai. And unsurprisingly, this did lead to a monk being killed and a couple being injured, which is not nice for them. But the Japanese in Shanghai then riot and burn down a factory, which kills 2 Chinese, and fighting breaks out. China appeals to the League of Nations, which shows how toothless it is, because nothing happens. So it's kind of like Ukraine appealing to the United Nations over Russia invading it. And a truce is only called on the 5th of May, which is supposed to call for Japanese military withdrawal and then to Chinese boycotts of Japanese products. Yeah. No. But it does then contribute to the next event, which is what takes place on the 15th of May. The assassination of Inukai Tyoshi. And there is a reason why my whole series on Anglo-Japanese relations hasn't been moved forward. It's that I'm waiting for about 4 books to do it properly to arrive. Because, of course, if you can't get to the archives, I'm having to do it book-based. And one of those books, which I thought I managed to hunt down, I managed to get a Japanese language version of, which I can't read. But I've sent it to a friend who's translating for me. The trouble is, that friend is in Poland. Very, very smart gentleman. But yeah, he's in Poland, so it's gone all the way to Poland for him to translate to English. Cool dude. Anyway. What's interesting about in Unukai is he actually had specialized in Chinese studies while at university, and then worked as a journalist. He's served in the Imperial Japanese Army during the Satsuma Rebellion as well, he went with them as a reporter. He's a very, very good politician, and yet he's assassinated in what is an attempted coup. And it involves elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy, aided by cadets in the Imperial Japanese Army. So, a rare time of collaboration between the services. And in fact, Inukai Tyoshi is assassinated by 11 young naval officers. But their trial and the support they receive from the Japanese population leads to extremely light sentences for the assassins, meaning that militarism is basically given unbound power. In other words, no one stands up, and it's this is a direct result of the ratification of the London Naval Treaty. So the 1930s London Naval Treaty directly leads to this, because it's considered so terrible that the Japanese Navy is not allowed to be built massively. Their initial plan had also been to kill Charlie Chaplin, as they felt that would lead to war with USA and a restoration in the name of the Emperor. In fact, thankfully for Charlie Chaplin and Inokai's son, Inokai Takaro, they were watching a sumo wrestling match, which probably saved their lives. They achieved an assassination and they got no further, but this meant for the Royal Navy watching it that they were very publicly worried now about Japan. And here is what results. London Naval Treaty of 1936, particularly Part 4. General and Safeguarding Clauses, such a nice sounding name. Articles 22, 23, 24, 25, and 26. Now let me expand these and you will see why these are interesting. So, no high contracting party shall by gift, sale, or any mode of transfer dispose of any of his surface vessels of war or submarines in such a manner that such vessel may become a surface vessel of war or a submarine in any foreign navy. This provision shall not apply to auxiliary vessels. I.e., this one's specifically aimed by America or Britain to stop it supplying South America, because, believe it or not, they're worried about South American navies and also Royal Navy's Dominion allies. And remember, South Africa and the Irish Free State both decide not to sign up to this treaty. I think it's this one, yes. Article 26. Nothing in the present treaty shall prejudice the right of any high contracting party, in the event of loss or accidental destruction of a vessel, before the vessel in question has become overage, to replace such vessel by a vessel of the same category or subcategory as soon as particulars of the new vessel mentioned in Article 12b shall have reached all the other high contracting parties. So basically, if you want to get a new fleet, have a load of accidents. Article 24. If any high contracting party should become engaged in a war, such high contracting party may, if he considers the naval requirements of his defence as materially affected, suspend, insofar as he is concerned, any or all of the obligations of the present treaty, provided that he shall promptly notify the other high contracting parties that the circumstances require such suspension, and shall specify the obligations it is considered necessary to suspend. The other high contracting party shall in such case promptly consult together and shall examine the situation thus presented with a view to agreeing as to the obligations of the present treaty, if any, which each of the said high contracting parties may suspend. Should such consultation not produce agreement, any of the said high contracting parties may suspend, insofar as he is concerned, any or all of the obligations of the present treaty, provided that he shall promptly give notice to the other high contracting parties the obligations which is considered necessary to suspend. Basically, if you start a war, you can build up to fight in it. Article 25. In the event of any vessel not conforming not in conformity with the limitations and restrictions as the standard states when armed prescribed by Articles 4, 5, and 7 of the present treaty being authorised, constructed or acquired by a power not a party to the present treaty, each high contracting party reserves the right to depart if and to the extent to which he considers such departures necessary in order to meet the requirements of his national security. And then Article 26. If the requirements of the national security of any high contracting party, in his opinion, be materially affected and any change of circumstances other than those provided for in Articles 6, 2, 24, and 25 of the present treaty, such high contracting party shall have the right to depart from the current year from his annual programs of construction and the declarations of acquisition. The amount of construction by any party to the treaty, within the limitations and restrictions thereof, shall not, however, constitute a change of circumstances for the purposes of the present article. The above mentioned right shall be exercised in accordance with the following provisions. So, this is the escalator clause. This is the realization that you can't guarantee that everyone's going to keep hunky-dory, that it's all going to be nice and safe. So they have an escalator clause in. So suddenly the Royal Navy in the China station has another job. And what is that job, Fluffy Research Assistant? That job is watching the Japanese Navy and ensuring they do exactly what they're supposed to do and they don't start breaking the treaty. Because if anyone breaks the treaty, if Britain breaks the treaty, Japan breaks the treaty, France, Italy break the treaty, America breaks the treaty, and is found out, that triggers the escalator clause for everyone. And yes, I do know this is put in there, and everyone's going, "Oh yeah, da 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 da," and yet at the same time, there is Chatfield and various government ministers going around saying the 14-inch is going to be the new gun of the Navy of battleships. 15 or 16-inch. They could have gone either way. Either way. Anyway, so who has the job of dealing with this post Second London Naval Treaty? Well, you have Admiral Sir Charles Colebrook Little. And for some reason, I have the wrong text appeared below there. So, well, we'll ignore that. Building's been fun. Anyway, Charles James Colebrook Little is a pretty cool character. He served in World War One, commanded the HMS Fearless, a cruiser, and a Grand Fleet submarine flotilla from 1916 to 1918. He commanded Cleopatra, C-class cruiser in the Baltic Sea, and become director of trade division of the Admiralty in 1920. So he really understood the importance of trade. He'd been captain of the fleet in the Mediterranean Station in 1922, sort of flag captain, and then became a senior staff officer at Royal Navy War College in 1924. He actually was served as captain of HMS Iron Duke in 1926 and director of the Naval Staff College in 1927. Then was commander of the 2nd Battle Squadron in 1930 and Rear Admiral submarines in 1931. What I'm saying is you couldn't have sent a more knowledgeable naval officer or a more practical one to go out there and command his post. In fact, in many ways, he would seem overqualified if you didn't realise the role was more than just counter piracy and presence. The role was also to keep an eye on Japanese construction, in which case such a technical officer makes a lot of sense. Hello. You're just going to take over my lap, aren't you? Yeah. All right. There we go. Oh, thank you. What does it say? Never work with children or animals? You don't consider yourself an animal, do you? That's the trouble. Right. So, after him comes one of my favourites, and one of the best to ever have the role, in my opinion, Percy Noble. Now, he had been the son of an Indian Army officer, and first entered the Royal Navy in 1894. So imagine his career. 1894, and he would serve with the Royal Navy till 1945. 51 years. He had also served, he was posted to HMS Hannibal in the Channel Fleet at the beginning of World War One. Then served in the Grand Fleet. Commanded cruisers Calliope and Calcutta, and then the battleship Barham. Also a senior naval officer in Harwich, 1925. He has quite a career, including spends time as Director of Naval Equipment from 1931. And Commander of 2nd Cruiser Squadron in 1932. Has served in the Admiralty as 4th Sea Lord. He has a lot of experience. And this gives him a lot of advantages when it comes to being the CNC in the Far East. Both these officers are technical officers, not just good commanders, and not just are commanders with war experience and valuable war experience, but more importantly, they are officers who have a great deal of technical knowledge and experience, which means in both cases, they wander up next to Japanese ships. They know exactly what they're looking at, and they know what they're looking for. Again, though, remember, the reason the Royal Navy maintains such a large force in the China Station is for counter-piracy. That's what they always tell people. So, now we have the Battle of Shanghai. And that includes aerial bombing of the international settlements. That includes amphibious assaults by the Japanese. That includes the Soviet embassy being blown up. In the Battle of Nanjing, it gets so bad that actually John Rabe, who I think is German and is, I think, the number two in the local Nazi party from Germany, for all the German workers out there in Nanjing, actually is the person who organizes and looks after, tries to protect civilians and intercede to stop the civilians being massacred. When he comes back, he's kept well away from Hitler and all sorts of things. So I'm not sure what this says of it, but it was bad enough that a Nazi, who is certainly a voluntary Nazi, not one of the ones who who claim they joined just because they wanted to get ahead in life and all those things, but actually someone who joined up and was a card-carrying, very high-ranking in various roles Nazi, was so horrified by it he actually interceded. People who sign up to race theory. Eesh. And again, there are lots of issues going on, and it's another thing the Royal Navy's having to watch. Because guess who they send into Shanghai to look for to check that check the British citizens are okay? It's the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy are doing all this, and that's another reason why, when to an extent, the earlier Lucas assessment of why the Royal Navy got involved in things and whether they were selective in terms of their counter-piracy, one of the other balances you have to think is the other commitments their ships are having to do out there. Yes, they might want to get involved in every single event of piracy, but as Twit's account made clear, Twit's memorandum made clear, you had to watch your ammunition because you were at the end of a logistics train. You had to make sure you're going to have an impact. You had to be sure what you were shooting at. And also, you had to be in the right place because you had to have all that information. The only way you could have the right information was if you were in the right place. But if you were off in Shanghai or elsewhere watching the Japanese and what they were getting up to, or trying to keep an eye on the various things the Japanese are up to at sea, you can't be doing counter-piracy. Not unless there's a lot more ships sent. So, here is another assessment, and it's a cool one, because it gives you a story from the 1930s of piracy, and I think it illuminates a lot. So, here we go. The Shung, this is from Defining Piracy, the Shung Tam Quan case, and British piracy suppression in China in the early 1930s. Written by Peter Singleton, published in The Great Circle, April 1983. So it is 37 years old, but that doesn't mean it's bad. On 10th March 1928, the Kuomintang government at Nanking promulgated a new criminal code as part of its efforts to modernize the country and gain respect and recognition as a law-abiding state deserving of a place in the family of nations. Article 952 read, "Whoever navigates any vessel, it not being commissioned by a belligerent state, nor being part of the naval force of any state, with intent to employ threats or violence against other vessels, or the company or cargo of other vessels, commits the offence of piracy and shall be punished with death, imprisonment for life, or for not less than 16 years. Same page points out the basis of all foreign naval presence on the China station was a seemingly innocuous clause in the supplementary treaty of 1844 between China and Great Britain. It resulted from British dissatisfaction with the provisions of the 1842 Treaty of Nanking, which had opened 5 Chinese ports to Western maritime commerce. The new accord sought to regularize import and export tariffs and to have commercial dealings between Chinese and foreigners based on a British-sponsored set of general regulations. This was to ensure uniformity of treatment at the 5 treaty ports, and complementary to this objective was the aim expressed in Article 10 to enforce good order and discipline amongst the crews of merchant shipping. To this end, one cruiser, I do love the fact it's spelled with a Z rather than S, was to be stationed at each of the open ports. The same right was soon extended to every other treaty power, desirous of exercising similar supervision over its own nationals on the China coast. So, it's to watch the merchant crews and counter piracy. Page 52. Examine those portions of the King's regulations destined to define situations which justified foreign intervention ashore. In general, naval parties were to be landed only to protect British nationals in the most exceptional circumstances, such as demonstrated incapacity of the sovereign authority to fulfill its obligations to foreigners. Such landings being described as a derogation of sovereignty. Even when warranted by exceptional circumstances, the naval officer had to be certain that those requesting his assistance were in real danger, and aid was to be offered only to British subjects. Intervention ashore could take the form only of offering British nationals asylum aboard ship, by making boats available to bring them to safety. Landing parties could go ashore only in situations where British lives and property were in actual danger from violence which cannot otherwise be controlled. A senior naval officer present was in all cases to subordinate himself to and take advice from any British consular or diplomatic authorities on the spot. He had complete freedom of action only in the absence of such authority, and any naval action ashore was seen very much as a last resort after the failure of representatives to local sovereign authorities. Similar restrictions applied to requests for assistance from British ship owners. That is, they could be granted only when uncontrolled violence presented a real threat to life and property, where actual and wrongful violence seemed likely, despite remonstrances with responsible local authorities ashore. In simple terms, there are rules of engagement over and above Twit's memorandum as well. There are actual rules of engagement, and this is also ties your hands when you're dealing with pirates. You have to be sure they're pirates. You have to be sure what they're doing. You have to be sure what's going on. If you're not, you're going to get into trouble. And that's not a fun experience for anyone. No one wants to get into trouble if they can avoid it. And I was asked by a question. So you can see Hong Kong, this is a map which is pretty much to scale, has Hong Kong and has Daya Bay, which is what the British referred to as Bias Bay. As you can see, that is not that far away from Hong Kong, and it is in there that they found most of the pirates. So, any naval commander on station has to balance why they're there, to serve British interests, why they're publicly there, for counter-piracy and protection of British interests, why they're really there, to monitor China, monitor Japan, monitor what's going on, with actually doing counter-piracy. It's complicated. You can quickly run out of ships if you're chasing every single pirate. So, limiting it to British ships, British-owned ships, by British individuals who are based in Britain and are companies which are registered in Britain, might seem like incredibly selective and incredibly, patronizing. But there is a reason for it. It makes those rules of engagement very easy because you can automatically satisfy those rules of engagement if it's a ship which belongs to a company which is based in Britain. It automatically follows. And why do I say this is complicated? Well, because of the very case this paper is actually about. The Sheng Tam Kwong case. Now, first off, I have to introduce you to Lo Hin Xing, first Chinese president of Hong Kong Bar Association and key lawyer in the Sheng Tam Kwong case, and a very, very cool gentleman. It gets up to all sorts of fun stuff. Anyway, here's an outline of the case. On the 4th of January 1931, Sheng Tam Kwong and 11 Chinese associates aboard two junks chased and fired on a cargo carrying junk in international waters outside of Hong Kong. The pursuit lasted for half an hour, with the intending pirates coming to within 200 yards of their intended victim. At this point, two Chinese steamers, Hang Sung and Shi Chao, intervened, and the British destroyer HMS Somme of the Royal Navy's anti-piracy patrol was summoned. The pirates were arrested and brought for trial on a charge of piracy jure gentium before the Hong Kong Supreme Court. Chief Justice J.R. Wood, however, refused to convict them and reserved the case on the legal problem of whether an accused person may be convicted of piracy in circumstances where no robbery has been occurred. Chief Justice Wood identified two major problems. The first concerned the jurisdiction his court had over foreigners, which in turn revolved around the relationship between international and municipal law. The second difficulty concerned the meaning of English statutes referring to piracy. Was a person guilty of attempted piracy to be considered a felon? If not, then Wood claimed he could not convict him under the statutes from which his court derived its jurisdiction. Here's the problem. Would you have the same problem if that was a British-owned steamship with a British company that was all based in Britain? No. There is firm legal groundings for that scenario. But you have ships which are owned in Hong Kong, theoretically. One of them. Two are Chinese ships. You have all sorts of people. It's a complicated scenario. You know what they were doing. You've got lots of witnesses. They were firing another ship. They were tracking it down until intervened by two steamships basically coming up and going, what are you doing? And those steamships, by the way, presumably have guards aboard, which kind of helps. Which the junk doesn't have guards. The cargo-carrying junk didn't have guards aboard. You also have the case of the fact that Sheng Tam Kwong is kind of interesting because the reason he's defending them is because they're put up for the death penalty, which is supposed to what they'll automatically get. Instead, they get released. He actually supports the death penalty for crimes of murder most heinous and premeditated. He feels that any murder which can be considered a crime of passion or a delinquency is not murder, and there should not. Well, is not the same level of murder and shouldn't be, have the death penalty. In this case, no robbery had been committed because they've been stopped. Definitely no murder had been committed because they've been stopped. So technically, under the rules that existed at the time, they hadn't committed a crime. They'd been trying to commit a crime, but just firing your weapon in the general direction of someone apparently isn't a crime. It's a problem for counter-piracy operations when you have this as a scenario. So, fun times had by all. Counter-piracy in the 1920s and 1930s. There were about 4 or 5 incidents which had the full carrier troops landing approach. Between 300 and 500 soldier personnel landed each time. Always a mixture of sailors, marines, and Hong Kong police. mostly in the late 1920s. After that, you tend to have Hong Kong police turning up with Chinese soldiers from the National Army, which makes sense. All that work with dinners for Dr. Sun's mausoleum being, finally finished and him finally being interned on HMS Kent is not done for the fun of it. That dinner builds a relationship, so you don't have to have British soldiers going and getting involved, which is useful because then the British soldiers can instead be concentrating on things like training for training for full-on war and securing Hong Kong. Which, by the way, everyone knows you can't do. So, again, my classic point is if there had been a supreme commander who was worthy of that name and worthy of that role, put in charge of Britain in the Far East, i.e., taking charge of Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, Australia, the force in Australasia, and in the South China Sea, and there was one supreme commander for the whole area, command all those forces. The reinforcements to Hong Kong would never have arrived. They would have gone to Singapore. Everything would have gone to Singapore, and Singapore would have been properly defended, and it would have been organised, because that would have been, and that is actually what their sort of plan. If we go back to the beginning conference, that was the British plan, and it makes sense. For counter-piracy operations, the British goes through, again, Lucas puts this in his journal article, about 3 phases. He calls it the ignorance phase, the basically active phase, and the relying on the government phase. And there are various reasons for this. I would say in the final phase, you finally have a government worthy of its name that you can actually rely on. If you don't actually have a government you can rely on, there's no point trying to rely on it. I would also say in the post-First World War phase, I would be careful about saying whether incidents were or were not dealt with. We in this modern world get used to a level of connectivity. And from some of the accounts I've read, I'm fairly sure it was more of an informal, we're blasting out the waters and there will be a bill for shells put in and that'll be it. Because that's all it needed to be. There was a press building up, and believe it or not, the South China Morning Post and things like that had some great articles in it. But there's not really the organization that we would necessarily consider that's going to put pressure or report things if they happen. In the mid to late 20s, that's when you get a lot of activist involvement, and you need to. In many ways, the activist British unilateral policies and unilaterally getting in actually takes pressure off the national government which is forming. Sounds weird, doesn't it? But let me put it this way. If the people who are doing piracy are getting pummeled and seeing the level of force being deployed against them going greater and greater, then they have to start thinking, well, do we want to stay and do this? Is it economical to do it? And seeing as they're usually local warlords, or shall we throw our lot in with the national government and combine in with them and find another income stream through being corrupt local governors or whatever? No, I'm sure Chinese patriots. They're survivors. The price of survival is getting too high in one profession, you change the profession. And that's certainly what they were doing. Now, on to the next thing. And as always, remember, please, if you like these videos, please do like them. Please consider subscribing. Maybe press the little bell down there. We have a Patreon, which if you want to fund my book habit is always thank you very much. And we have a Discord. where you can come and chat. And I use Discord ideas as well, sometimes for videos. So for February, the Patrons' Choice winners are Royal Navy's strategic role in 1980s NATO, as suggested by Joseph Sullivan, 14 votes. And fast attack craft, i.e. torpedo, U, and gunboats in World War I Adriatic, Kleinkrieg, in coastal warfare, as suggested by Carl von Gasberg. Carl has finally got the Adriatic into it. And a good one, too. And now, as we all know, with the patrons' votes and choices, what I do is I open up basically a general post on Patreon, and anyone who's a patron can put topics there and suggest ideas. And I go through and I pick usually 6 or so. And the week after, I put them up for a week-long vote. So they are the sort of filtration capacity I use, and please understand this one, is that can I do it in the time allocated? There is one topic which was suggested a couple of months ago, which I didn't put in the Patron's Choice vote, but I have actually put it to one side, and I'm planning on doing it when all the books are there. Hello, I know, you're being a guard dog. Good boy. And it's always fun when a poodle presents a guard dog. And the other criteria is, can I do I actually think I can add something to the topic? So, those are the 2 criteria. The only 2 criteria I use for filtration. Can I do it in the time allocated? And can I add something to the topic when I do it, above and beyond just what other videos are already out there? And so far I think I've done okay. I could do better, but well, that's what the new office is about, because I'll have access to all my books rather than whichever books I haven't yet currently got in boxes. And it's fun having every other week getting all the boxes out onto my bed, changing books over, and then putting them back, and then probably about 4 days in, realizing I need a book which I put back in a box. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you enjoyed part 3. Part 4 will be me going through the questions which have been left as comments underneath the live, and possibly the questions which have been left underneath these as well. So I might do that and record that tomorrow, as it's Wednesday, and instead, take the evening off. Go and do some more building on the offices. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you. Take care.